Hey folks, I'm Brett Kinsella. I'm founder and editor of Voicebot.ai. Actually, more prescient to today's conversation, I'm also the founder and research director of Voicebot Research. Many of you know Voicebot.ai for the research that we do. And one of the companies we've collaborated with on the research front over the last several years is Applause. And I'm really excited to bring some of that conversation to you today. They've really got some interesting insights that we're going to call out. Now, what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about AI projects in general. We're going to talk about voice embedded in products, so conversational AI tools embedded in projects. We're going to talk about conversational AI and customer service chatbots. We're going to talk about voice biometrics in some of those projects. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to extract what might be lessons learned for you that are going to apply across all projects, plus specific insights around these different types of initiatives that you might have going on. And in between, we actually have some data. And I know some of you saw some of the things that we're putting out online on social media, a few of the charts. Applause has done some really interesting survey research on a global basis of consumers who are using natural language interfaces. And as you know, VoiceBot's done a lot of that as well. And so we have a few charts that I think will illustrate some of the changes that are going on in the space. We're going to talk about voice assistants and mobile apps. We're going to talk about chatbots. We're going to talk about a bunch of different things that I think will be helpful, because it's clear to me we're in a different phase of voice AI development and conversational AI development. We had the big consumer push a couple years ago, and really over the last 18 months, it's been all enterprise all the time. There's still some stuff going on in the consumer space with Alexa and Siri, but it's ultimately the enterprise which is driving this forward, where most of the innovation is happening. And Applause has a front row seat to this. So just one housekeeping item before I bring Emerson up on stage. We're going to do Q&A at the end after we have this conversation. Emerson and I, he's going to show you some data and some updates, best practices that they've developed. But we're going to do this Q&A. You can enter Q&A questions anytime. We're going to get to it at the end. So if you don't mind, just use that Q&A feature in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom. The chat's also open. If you guys want to talk to each other, that's fine. No problem. If you put a question in chat, we may or may not find it. We'll try, but if you put it in that Q&A, we'll definitely try to get to it. So I think the thing to do right now is introduce our featured speaker. So Emerson, you can come on up. Emerson Sklar is the Senior Director of AI and Machine Learning at Applause. He started out as a gaming software developer just a few years ago. He's a test engineer, so he's done all the grunt work in the tech stack. And that was before moving into program account, evangelists, more strategic roles within organizations. And he's been exposed to many, many different projects in the space. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He's also an award-winning executive in the AI space, but that'll come out very, very soon. We're not going to talk about that today. Emerson Sklar, welcome to the webinar today, and welcome back to one of our VoiceBot featured programs.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It is exciting to be back. Exciting to talk to you today.
Okay, so I think we should get right into it. People are ready to go. So I'm going to let you take over and start talking about this, and I'll jump in, so we can have some conversation. But I know we've got a lot to get through today, so let's get started.
Sounds great. So thought we would start off with a particularly interesting and exciting use case of VR and AR. So for people that don't know about Applause, we are the world's largest crowdsourced digital quality company. We have a global community of over 1 million individuals representing every individual persona, language, use case that companies might target for their real customers. And in this case, we work with one of the largest global tech companies who are really leading the charge in bridging the virtual and the real world with a suite of futuristic VR and AR powered devices, headsets, glasses, you name it. And so they have a pipeline to develop, obviously, many future years worth of new devices, but they still have a need to train devices to test devices in secret and far in advance of announcing them or releasing them to the market. And since we have that team of individuals and community members all over the world, we worked hand in hand with them to build up an infrastructure to do moderated data collection to train their AI models in secure, confidential facilities in each one of their supported markets, and then ultimately supported them moving from that sort of facility-based model to moving to real at-home, in the wild testing and training once it was released. And one of the main features of these devices is the embedded voice assistant. And in this case, they needed over 10 million utterances in each of the slew of languages that they support to meet their quality and accuracy goals. And that's something that uniquely leverages the crowd, uniquely leverages our ability to scale to the tens of thousands of individuals that were required to cover that vocal diversity. But as you can imagine, with AR and VR, it's not just voices. And the company has tens of thousands of employees who could provide at least some of that vocal diversity. But what they struggle with, even with an employee base like that, are things like the different body structures to ensure physical fit of the headsets, the ability to track limbs and digits, different facial structures, makeup, things to face and eye tracking. And then different environments. VR is, comparatively simpler. It's in typically small 3D spaces with lots of cameras and monitors around, but AR is in the real world. And so it's got to work in real environments, varying cell conditions, different locations, looking at different points of interest. So what did we learn? Well, first, we learned that like most companies, they underestimated just how complex it is to manage a big data collection project like that. It's really, really cool tech. They assumed that they could get the data that they need through internal employees, through friends and family, through diehard fans, but they didn't really consider everything that goes into that program. There's lots of secret pre-production hardware, so they had to be sensitive to their IP, and it also meant that they were limited in the number of devices that they had available to do the collection. And they needed to do it in the dozens of markets that they support, but even a company that size didn't have locations in each of those markets. So they needed some manageable, repeatable, and efficient way to set up facilities in each of those markets, to stock the facilities with moderators, with security, and then to efficiently schedule, again, tens of thousands of individuals to come in, use the devices so they could collect the data they need at reasonable speed and reasonable scale. And so the size of that program ended up being far greater than they thought initially. And even for a giant company of that size, is not something that would possibly have been internally manageable, even if they had the appetite to do so.
Yeah, so I have a couple comments about this that I thought jumped out at me. And I'm glad you started with this one, in part because I actually think a lot of the people in the conversational AI space need to be thinking about metaverse spaces, whether it's a VR headset or some of the 3D world you see on flat screens, because there's a lot of not just opportunity, but a lot of need for conversational interactions in those spaces, because a lot of people are going to be setting up 3D virtual spaces. And what are they going to have to do if they're a company? They're going to have to do customer support in that space, and they're not going to be manning them 24/7 with human-backed avatars. So these bots, these chatbots are actually a really good solution for that. And then people who are building in this space also, this is a real opportunity for them to extend into another area beyond customer service, for example, and other types of engagement. So I love that you brought this up. And I think there's a VR headset part, but there's also all these other spaces, which are going to be 2D. So people should be thinking about it. But the other thing that jumped out at me, well, one of the two things that jumped out at me was that it's always important for people to understand that AI models ultimately are only as good as the data that is feeding them.
Yep.
And that it's hard to anticipate how people are actually going to use something when it's in the wild. We learned this a long time ago in the conversational AI space, that you have to get it out there and you have to plan to come out, have some issues, monitor your logs, improve if you're going to do a launch and learn. But a lot of this you can do and take care of before you go live, before you have the risk of a public problem on your hands.
And that's a common theme that we're going to talk about on several of these other use cases as well, but is hypercritical in here. I mean, that second point, this company also didn't, ahead of trying to do the collection, didn't really truly think about and try and understand the complexity of those real users and the way that they would use it in, once it's deployed to the market. And you and I have talked about this before. I mean, that's one of the driving convictions of Applause, is that there really is no substitute for using your real customers, using real users. And like, so in this case, the tech that they had was beautiful. The optical and infrared cameras, the devices were very complex, very accurate. The model was initially quite well trained on sort of like a Vitruvian Man style, perfect physical specimen. But they learned that, like people have piercings and tattoos or facial hair, like things that impact the optical camera. And then there are things like makeup or even sunscreen that have drastic impacts on an infrared camera. Let alone, some accessibility issues, people that have perhaps a physical deformity or missing limbs. And, all of those things are critical to build in to ultimately have it be successful once it's released. And they're really impossible, regardless of the company size. They're impossible to try and do with a fixed internal team. And they're not things that might jump out at you just sort of casually considering what kind of data you might need to collect.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that I wanted to point out was the difference between generic versus custom data sets. And this is maybe the non-sexy aspect of the AI system. Everybody loves the application when you're interacting with it, whether it's some visual system, a conversational system. That's the show, that's the magic, right?
Sure.
And a lot of these solutions are initially trained on generic data sets, and that's okay to a certain extent, but you can only get so far. And I think it's really interesting, particularly when you think of these application specific solutions that are being rolled out. You really need some sort of bespoke or custom data set to get you up to that point where I think most people would feel comfortable going out into the public and then iterating the next level.
Yeah, and I think there has been a big market shift, certainly in the last few years, where especially enterprises are realizing that for enterprise use cases, those canned data sets, really are not, at best, they are not that helpful. At worst, they're sometimes quite, almost destructive or misleading in making people think that it's going to perform a certain way. And so getting that custom tailored, that bespoke solution, like you mentioned, is both critical and is proven time and again to be well worth the investment for companies serious about AI.
Yeah, and we saw that with, we'll say, an unnamed big tech company who rolled out a voice assistant early on, really had a very excellent voice recognition system for a very specific demographic that happens to live in Northern California and a couple other places around the country. And then as soon as they went broadly across the country and then to other countries, they found, oh yes, there are different pronunciations, different dialects that we have to be able to accommodate. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Anything else we should do to wrap up on the VR side, or should we move to the chatbot?
No, yeah, let's talk about chat.
Okay.
So this one is near and dear to my heart. The notion of automated customer support. It's one of the biggest use cases in AI, and I think people generally understand why. I mean, it has major impact on customer satisfaction. Unlike some other use cases, it has really tangible, significant ROI. And I mean, everybody, people out there in the audience, every single person has the shared frustrating experience of calling into their bank or their insurance company or an airline and having it not understand what you say in the automated phone system and just, being extremely frustrating and then preventing you from completing the job that you need or making you upset before you get to ultimately talking to a real human agent. We've worked on huge number of IVR and chat projects over the years with all sorts of organizations, and many of them have made some sort of prior investment in AI. But for most of those companies, and for most companies in general, this is their first real conversational AI initiative. And what we see happening time and again is companies get far too ambitious. They try to turn their virtual agent into something like the computer from Star Trek that understands everything and can answer any kind of question, and not really doing something that's achievable and also meaningful to the user. So let's think about a couple examples. So We worked recently with one of the largest US fintech companies who had a legacy touch tone and very rudimentary voice-powered IVR telephone system. And they were modernizing it with modern conversational AI tools. And they had a very, very complex phone tree that had evolved over the last couple decades. They had over 100 different intents or like functions that you could try and accomplish, hundreds of different slots or variables that could drive those intents. And this was their first conversational AI initiative. And they decided that for V1, they were just going to port over all of that functionality into the new AI platform in one fell swoop. And like Brett, think about that. I mean, you and I have talked a ton since the early days of like Alexa skills and Google Assistant actions. I mean, I don't know any company that on their first try knocks out something that is that complex and mission critical successfully. It's not a recipe for success. It ultimately undermines the good work that some of these AI teams do, and it reduces confidence in the solution, and similarly reduces the likelihood of those companies making further meaningful investments in AI. And so, what I always recommend, and what I see, some of the successful companies do, is start small, demonstrate success, grow obviously the education and capabilities of their team, and then similarly grow the capabilities of the AI products in tandem.
Yeah, we see this time and again. So people want these simple, successful interactions, right? We see that also in consumer voice assistants, and that carries over to these support and engagement activities as well. That if you just look at what consumers naturally migrate to, it's these simple interactions. They want to be able to use natural language as the input, but they don't necessarily want to have some sort of complex conversation. That's not their intent. Their intent is goal-oriented. It's not trying to build, usually, not trying to build a relationship.
Yeah.
And so you can add bells and whistles on top of it, but you need to nail a few use cases. And this is what we talk about, building that cognitive trust, that people, when they come back, they know, oh, if I want to solve this problem, it reliably solves this problem every time for me, no matter how I ask the question. And then maybe it answers 2 or 3. And then if it doesn't know how to do that, it hands me over to, let's say, a human agent, or takes me to another place where I might be able to resolve that through a self-service model. And that builds trust that when they go to the conversational agent, it'll be an honest broker. It's going to say, I can help you with this, and I will, or I won't help you with that. If the other thing happens, if you try to do too much, you undermine that trust, and then they start to think it can't do anything. Even the things it can do, and when you add new things, it's like, oh, I'm sure it can't do that. And so then they just keep going to the agent, and it undermines the whole thing that the enterprise is trying to accomplish, this 24/7, consistently reliable, easily accessible brand building experience by helping people solve their problem faster, and instead makes the consumer like not trust them for anything because they have this bad experience with a bot.
And yeah, it's fascinating to me that unlike in mobile apps, for example, if I'm using a mobile app and I hit a button and it doesn't work, or the app crashes, I think the app is broken. Maybe I think there's something wrong with my phone, but my assumption is that the app is broken. But research that we've done shows that people in conversational AI internalize that. They think, oh, I did something. It didn't understand me, so I did something wrong. I must be messing up. And yet it erodes that confidence and trust much more rapidly than would be the case in traditional GUI apps. And that theme of doing what your customers actually want. I mean, we worked with a big US retailer that I'm sure almost everybody here uses, if not daily, then uses certainly weekly. That was building a conversational agent that was going to be, they took the notion of conversational far too seriously. It was going to be your best friend. You could chat to it all day long about things that are totally unrelated to the types of products that you could purchase from it, and spent a lot of time, a lot of money, then did some internal focus groups and heard that maybe something was amiss. And so what we did was leverage huge volume of their real high priority target customers. Not somebody like me who uses it once a month, but somebody who's spending a top tier amount of money with them, who has their credit card, and found that, hey, nobody really wants to have that kind of casual chit chat with their voice bot. They want to be able to like check their order status or get the hours for a local store. And so really, yeah, like listening to those target meaningful users is the best way to figure out, what is actually going to move the needle for them. And then ultimately what's going to move the needle for a business, what's going to provide that kind of return on this not insignificant investment that they're making.
Yeah, amazing. Yep, 100%.
So as a little change of pace, wanted to talk about some of the recent research that we've done. And Brett, like you mentioned, Voicebot and Applause have partnered on a great deal of research in the past. We actually recently did a survey of thousands of individuals on a wide range of AI topics, and we'll be following up with everybody out in the audience to provide a report that we're producing on some of those findings. But there were a couple, really relevant, interesting learnings from that. I think this first one. So there's lots of similar frustrations in both chat and speech-based virtual customer support agents. And in time and again, the biggest frustration, the biggest detractor from customer satisfaction is not being able to do what somebody thinks they can do, not being able to find the information or complete a task that they wanted. And one thing I love about this space is how often I'm reminded that I'm not an ideal target to solicit qualitative feedback for every kind of experience. Like I might have, we might have the technical, the historical industry experience, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily the relevant perspective for qualitative information for many companies. And so like that first one, I for many businesses would not be able to tell a company what answers their customers were looking for that they couldn't find. Really, the only way to do it is to ask those real customers and get that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I look at this chart with chatbot, so first of all, it's very similar to what we see with voice assistants of all stripes. But let's look at those first two together. I could not find the answers I was looking for. Chatbot directed me to irrelevant pages or sources. Those to me are very, very similar. Now, people had to choose one that was the most frustrating problem. But if I do some quick math, that looks like 43%. Almost half of the people are like, wait a second, it couldn't do what I expected it to do. So that jumped out at me. And then the other one that comes up is the one that's number 4 down. So the chatbot did not understand what I'm saying. And that is a perpetual frustration with folks. In fact, in the smart speaker realm, it is the number one frustration that people regularly cite, even though it's been for years. Better. Yeah, it's since 2018 we've been doing these national surveys. And even though it's gotten much better, what's happened is consumer expectations have risen in parallel. So it's gotten better in terms of understanding people, but people's expectations are more. And so they're sort of in this neck and neck race. And if you are a company who's implementing a chatbot or a voice assistant for some sort of customer interaction, really work on this understanding piece, get your data sets down, go to your logs time and time again. And then the second thing is really try to figure out what they're asking for and actually pull that data in, figure out where you're failing, find new items. When they get pitched over to customer support, live customer support, make a notation of what it was that they looked for, because you can see it in the clickstream data where they went or what the conversation was in the chat and how it was resolved. Because a lot of times you actually have that information. It's just your bot isn't designed properly to actually answer the question in that way.
Yeah, those are very solvable problems, but really speak to like a missed opportunity and missing the expectations of your customers. And that I think is one of the neat things here with this second chart. I mean, it's fascinating to see just how many people expect most or all mobile apps to have some kind of voice component. That in this case, 85% expect to have either voice assistant or voice search built into their apps. And like people out in the audience, I mean, think about if your company has a mobile app, does it have voice? Chances are it probably doesn't. And but like, would you think that your customers would expect that that it should have voice? I mean, again, the vast majority of mobile apps today, except for a few specific use cases, don't have that kind of capability. And that's another sort of discrepancy between us on the technical side and people out in the world, real users, as well as then a great opportunity to differentiate from your competitors and to drive up your real CSAT.
Yeah, this is a real frustration point, I think, for a lot of enterprises who are thinking, hey, I'm focused on all these other projects, and now consumers continually want more stuff, right? And this one, I think, should surprise a lot of people, but if they look at the expectation around chatbots and websites, it's actually fairly similar, that at this point, consumers assume that they should have some sort of way to interact through a conversational assistant on websites. And then now we're talking about voice, because voice is, in many ways, you can do chat as well, but voice is a natural affordance for mobile in particular, particularly mobile apps. And I think everybody can sort of blame this on navigation, search, and music, because those were the first types of solutions, the application categories that added voice. People got accustomed to it. It's like, oh, geez, well, why can't I use this elsewhere? I should be able to use this elsewhere. A lot of people just put that little microphone in the search bar, and that's super helpful. You shouldn't overlook how helpful that is. I remember talking to a major national bank, it's just about a year and a half ago. They just deployed their voice assistant in their mobile app. Why? Because they had over 300 features in their mobile app. Try to expose 300 features in a mobile app drop-down menu, please. And so people kept asking for, how do I do this? How do I do that? And a lot of that stuff was in there. Just there was no way to find it. And when you brought the voice assistant there, it actually surfaced all these long tail solutions. And that's that's like a hidden gem that people don't understand with voice. They think like any other UI type of project, what you do is like, what do people use most? We'll give them voice. That'll make it better. Actually, no, because the things that people use most, you already have the real estate and the affordances from UI visual standpoint to help them solve those problems quickly. It's not that you should necessarily overlook them, but you probably already have a pretty good experience. Where the experience gets undermined is those long tail features that they don't access very often and they have no idea how to get to, or if you even offer that feature.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's I think that missed opportunity there expands beyond just sort of the vertical and industry use case. But curious to get your thoughts on this chart, because this again, feeling that I'm not always the best, don't always have the best perspective of the expectations of real target users. I was very surprised by these results. Almost counterintuitively would have assumed actually the exact opposite type of results about interest or desire to use voice in mobile apps.
Yeah, it is interesting because it does go against what we would expect, which is younger people are more likely to adopt new technology. Yep. And we see that time and again. I see it in the smart speaker report, and we see it with hearables and using voice assistants through wireless earbuds and those types of things, where the younger you are, the more likely you are to make use of those features. But interestingly enough, voice and mobile apps, and this actually comes up in a couple different places in a recent survey that we've done, and it repeats from a couple previous years as well, is that as age goes up, they're actually more interested. There's more expectation or more interest that they're going to use. Some expectations are a little bit different, but more interest in having voice in the mobile app. Now, there's a couple reasons that we believe drive this. So first of all, we think that younger users are actually a little bit better at using the visual interfaces because they're native to mobile and they're using them more, and they have better thumb dexterity, maybe they have better eyesight, all the things that make mobile like a better experience. And so for them, this idea that they would be against having voice in many of them, it's not that they like, no, I don't want it because it's a big negative. It's just they think it's unnecessary. And you see this thing where that's an equal number of people say, yeah, that would be nice, or no, I don't want that. And then you move up, that really big jump happens in the first age group. So you're moving into that 30 to 44 group where 45% of the people like say, yes, I really want this. And then there's maybe around 30% of people say, no, I don't want. And then you just see that gap getting wider. So in this case, it's not that young people won't use it if you add voice to your mobile app, because a lot of them actually will. And some of those people who are against it will actually start to use it anyway, because those long tail things that they're not thinking about right now. But it's a really great opportunity to develop loyalty and affinity with some of your more mature users, of whom most of them are millennials and Gen X.
And most of whom have have more perhaps time and opportunity to interact with brands and be captured as longer term customers.
Yeah, that's right.
And you had mentioned earlier some of those use cases, and certainly like myself for personal usage of voice, maps, long form audio, and search are the most frequent use cases I have. It is super interesting these remaining use cases that both people have interest in. And I think today there is very, very little presence of voice in common restaurant, shopping, travel, mobile solutions.
Yeah, the way we characterize is there's actually a voice assistant supply gap in this space, and in fact, the consumer interest exceeds the availability of these in many of these use cases, and this chart's much longer. I think it goes 18 use cases deep, but and they're almost all of them are in the double digits. And people really want this. And some interesting things with maps, actually, it used to be higher, but this number of people who want it now is lower. We think it's because all navigation apps actually have it, and so that we can see as more navigation apps add like this, like I don't actually need it because they already have it. But again, like we've got music, maps, search, those things have trained people to think that this is very useful. And then the other thing I pull out of this is restaurant, shopping, retail, and travel and hotel. Now, there are search elements for each of those, but there are also commerce elements for each of those. And I think that is something that people here today should take note of, that consumers, first of all, each one of these items actually involves complex search, much more complex search than a lot of other industries. You think about shopping and retail, I think about travel and hotel. Travel and hotel is configurations, but also assortment, like how many things could you choose from? Shopping and retail, obviously, SKU count, assortment, all these other types of things, really important. Makes it hard to be successful in that engagement. So anything with voice, it can actually help you narrow that down more effectively. Natural language, as opposed to thumb typing or something like that. And then restaurants is, again, one of those things. It's got both search and commerce associated with it. Lots of options. How do I get to what I want? Those types of things. And so I think people should, take note of that these things that are either the front end of a purchase cycle, such as search for something you're going to consume, or further down in the actual transaction cycle, are actually fairly high in the list of consumers who said, hey, I think this would be really useful in the apps I use every day.
And it's again, a good opportunity for companies in those spaces to differentiate themselves from all of the other competitors in that space by providing that type of capability and fulfilling that interest.
Absolutely.
So we got one more use case, and then we'll jump over to the Q&A. So another incredibly common one that we see, which is identity verification, and there's lots and lots of different applications. There's some that try to determine who a person is based on a picture of their face and their ID, like passport or driver's license. There are some that we work with that do automated test proctoring and use liveness detection to see if a real person's sitting in front of them or they're being spoofed somehow. There's AI-powered smart home solutions that I think many people out there probably use today that recognize individuals and individual behavior and then automatically sort of tailor the household experience based on their historical behavior. And so, one thing that we see, not just specific to this realm, but really across the board, is companies overlooking the need for separate testing data. And that testing data set, everybody understands you need a training data set, but that testing data set needs to be just as representative of the real diversity of users and the use cases as well. And it's critical because minor changes to AI models have drastic impacts on the results. And hopefully it's a positive impact. Sometimes it's a negative, but it's often not very well understood. And having good testing data lets you really do an apples to apples evaluation of changes that you introduce to that model. And that testing data needs to be separate from, from the training data. We do see many companies that try to just reuse some part of their training data to do the evaluation and say, oh, my performance is, is stellar, is industry leading, and then are surprised when once it's deployed that it doesn't actually perform as well as they expected. But if we think about some use cases, so one project we've supported the past few years is a big provider of identity verification services that's built into a lot of financial service applications today. And for them, I don't know if people out there are aware, in the United States, there are over 75 different types of government issued identity cards just in the US alone. Things like a child provisional license, an under 18 license, a diplomatic identity card. And each state has some subset of all of those individual card types. And each state's cards all look very different. And each state is constantly releasing new versions of those cards every few years and on their own totally separate schedule. And so what this company found is that as soon as they would train their model and sort of breathe a sigh of relief that everything was done, it was nearly immediately out of date for a really significant and meaningful portion of the US population. And with ID cards, it's not like you can just print out new versions of cards. So they needed a way to continuously collect new data as cards released. And even though it's a company with presence all across the country, they just don't have people internal to their company who would even be eligible for all of those different types of cards. And so it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that there's really no substitute for using your real target individuals. And again, that's a sort of beautiful capability of our crowdsource model. You and I may not have the right type of card or the right facial characteristics, the right skill. But what is great about being able to leverage community is that somebody in that community does.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me because one of the things I like about what you guys do is you have such a broad business. You work with a lot of large companies at scale, but you work with a broad set of companies and use cases. And so that's why I always like talking to you, because you come up with these little edge cases, or some of them actually are seemingly edge cases, but they're actually more common than you might consider. And that's one of the really interesting things. I think of it as like these hidden insights and that you have. And a lot of people might think of, oh, well, testing, it's a step I have to get through. I think if you're in the AI space, you should look at this very differently than if you're in the traditional software space. So in the traditional software world, we have a stable release. It tends to work indefinitely. And then you do an upgrade, and then you have to deal with problems, bugs, and then you sort it out, and then it's stable again. And then just until you mess with it again. AI systems are very different because the inputs are variable, and those can change over time. And the system, if you have a learning system that might be updating as well in real time, it might never actually be fully stable in the way you would think about a traditional software package. And so there's not only this idea of having a good product to launch with and do your traditional testing, but you also need to continually do it, because there's this continuous improvement, but there's also changes. So in the environment that can lead to regression without you actually adding any features.
I mean, and think about just Google searching something. The way that people search on the internet today is very different than it was a decade ago. It's very different than it was, even just a few years before that. And like the smart home company that I mentioned, they have lots of sort of anonymized data that they collect from real world usage, but they failed to recognize and effectively capture in their model that people's behavior changes, and that the way that my behavior is going to change is going to be different than the way that your behavior is going to change, is going to be different than the way that my parents, who are not technical at all, the way that their behavior is going to change. And then for those folks who again had had some camera-based facial recognition, didn't realize that people's faces change, and sometimes it's very gradual. Growing a beard, if I was going to grow a beard, it would take me months and months. So hopefully the system could properly handle that. But getting a haircut, like, it can be a really significant change, in a very, very short period of time. And so they needed to not only collect sort of point in time data about individuals, but because the solution wasn't a fixed point in time solution, because people's characteristics that it was interacting with aren't fixed, they needed some sort of longitudinal approach to both collecting the data and then refining and evolving their data set, both with the changing behavior of the users and their sort of changing expectations and interaction with their product.
Absolutely.
So in the interest of time, I wanted to jump over to some Q&A, but before we do that, wanted to leave with a few things. First, we just published a great white paper that articulates some best practices around establishing an AI program, not like a technical software application of AI, but the processes, the organizational structure, the way that you need to think about your initiative to succeed with what are becoming increasingly complex projects. And you can check it out at that URL listed on the screen. And then second, we'll be following up in the coming days with recording this presentation, as well as a detailed look at the results of this community survey. And we showed some data on the previous slides, but there's a whole lot more in there that you can leverage, just like some of these findings can leverage regardless of your team or particular project. And then, certainly if you have AI projects in your pipeline, or if you have already completed ones that you're trying to figure out how to improve or how to optimize, certainly don't hesitate to reach out. Look forward to an opportunity to hear about the use case and see if there might be some way to leverage a crowd to help support it.
Absolutely. Emerson, this has been great. Once again, we have this idea of hidden insights, like uncovering hidden knowledge. You nailed it today. I really like the examples you were able to come up with. And I think we learned a few things, right? So data is really important. Maybe people just need to be reminded of that, but there's some nuances here in terms of the scope of the data, when you apply it, continuously testing, and then also using some bespoke data sets. Get those custom data sets out there, and that really can take your solution to the next level. Avoid problems, but also potentially discover some new things that you can do to drive that delight into the customer interaction. So I think that's like hugely important. And then this idea that ultimately you need to succeed in something. And it's something that like you can consistently do. And a lot of times that means you've got all these things you could do, reduce scope, nail a few things, build that cognitive trust and expand it. Don't do what Apple did with Siri, where they overpromised and people thought for years Siri didn't work very well, even after they'd fixed all those problems. You can do this ahead of time and set expectations. So I think that's great. So Emerson Sklar, so the first thing before we get to Q&A, thank you so much for
having me. Yeah, this is great.